The morning mist hung heavy over Pine Ridge, Alabama, on September 15, 1991, as Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie knelt in her small bedroom for her final prayer before departing for the mission field. At 28 years old, Sarah possessed an unwavering faith that had drawn her to dedicate her life to serving God in remote villages of Guatemala. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes sparkled with the fervor of someone who believed deeply in her divine calling. "Lord Jesus," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly around the silver cross necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, "I place my life completely in your hands. Use me as your vessel to bring hope to those who have never heard your name. Keep me safe under your protection, and if something should happen to me, let my life be a testimony of your love." The prayer would prove to be prophetic in ways Sarah could never have imagined. Sarah had spent 3 years preparing for this mission trip through Covenant Community Church, a modest but vibrant congregation nestled in the heart of Pine Ridge's historic district. Pastor David G. Thornton, a gentleman in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes, had mentored Sarah through her theological studies and had become like a father to her after her own parents died in a car accident when she was 22. "Sarah, are you certain you're ready for this?" Pastor Thornton had asked her just the week before, his voice tinged with both pride and concern. "The villages you'll be visiting are incredibly remote. Communication will be limited, and the conditions will be harsh." Sarah had smiled with the confidence of youth and faith. "Pastor David, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. God has been preparing my heart for this mission since I was a child. I can feel His calling burning within me like a flame that cannot be extinguished." The church had raised $15,000 to support Sarah's 2-year mission commitment, money that came from bake sales, car washes, and the sacrificial giving of families who believed in her vision. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the church treasurer, and a woman whose own faith had been forged through decades of trials, had personally handed Sarah the final check. "Honey," Mrs. Hartwell had said, tears glistening in her 70-year-old eyes, "you carry the prayers and hopes of this entire congregation with you. We'll be praying for you every single day until you return to us safely." Sarah's departure from Pine Ridge had been marked by a tearful farewell service that filled Covenant Community Church beyond capacity. Friends from neighboring towns, former Sunday school students she had taught, and members of the community who had watched her grow from a shy teenager into a confident woman of God all gathered to send her off with their blessings. "Remember," Pastor Thornton had preached that final Sunday morning, his voice carrying across the packed sanctuary, "Our sister Sarah goes not in her own strength, but in the power of the Almighty God. She carries with her the light of Christ to illuminate the darkness in places where that light has never shone." Sarah had stood before the congregation wearing the simple blue dress her grandmother had sewn for her years earlier, clutching her worn leather Bible and the silver cross that seemed to catch the morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. "I want you all to know," Sarah had said, her voice trembling with emotion but strong with conviction, "that even if I never return to Pine Ridge, this mission is worth my life. Jesus said that whoever loses their life for His sake will find it. I go to Guatemala, not hoping to die, but prepared to live completely for Christ, whatever that may cost." The congregation had erupted in amens and applause, but many would later remember feeling an inexplicable chill when Sarah spoke those words, as if the Holy Spirit was preparing their hearts for something they couldn't yet understand. Sarah had maintained regular contact with Covenant Community Church for the first 18 months of her mission work. Her letters, read aloud during Sunday services, painted vivid pictures of the Guatemalan villages where she served, the children she taught to read using Bible stories, and the adults who were coming to faith through her patient ministry. "Dearest church family," she had written in February 1993, "yesterday I witnessed something that will remain etched in my heart forever. Maria, a grandmother who has lived 70 years without ever hearing the name of Jesus, accepted Christ as her Savior after months of gentle conversations. When she emerged from the river where Pastor Carlos baptized her, she looked at me with tears streaming down her weathered face and said, 'Now I understand why God sent you so far from your home. I am humbled beyond words to be used by God in such a magnificent way.'" But then, in March 1993, the letters stopped. Pastor Thornton had initially assumed that mail delivery delays were responsible for the lack of communication. Remote areas of Guatemala were known for sporadic postal service, and Sarah had mentioned in her last letter that political tensions in the region were making travel more difficult. However, as weeks turned into months, with no word from Sarah, concern began to ripple through the congregation of Covenant Community Church. Prayer meetings were organized specifically to intercede for Sarah's safety. Mrs. Hartwell organized a phone tree to contact supporting churches throughout Alabama, asking them to pray for their missing missionary. "Something's not right, Martha," Collins, Sarah's best friend since childhood, confided to Pastor Thornton. In June 1993, Sarah promised she would write at least once a month, no matter what. "She's never broken a promise in her life. Even if the mail was delayed, we should have heard something by now." Pastor Thornton had contacted the mission organization that had facilitated Sarah's placement in Guatemala, but their information was frustratingly limited. The organization confirmed that Sarah had been working in a village called San Pedro de la Cruz, about 3 hours by foot from the nearest town with telephone service. "We're concerned as well," admitted Robert Martinez, the mission coordinator, during a long-distance phone call that crackled with static. "Our last contact with the village pastor, Carlos Mendez, was in February. He reported that Miss Mackenzie was in good health and her ministry was flourishing. But when we sent our quarterly supply team to the village in May, they found it completely abandoned." The news hit Pine Ridge like a thunderbolt. An entire village abandoned. What could have happened to force hundreds of people to flee their homes? And where was Sarah in all of this? Could they have relocated due to political violence? Pastor Thornton asked, his heart racing with worry for his spiritual daughter. "It's possible," Martinez replied reluctantly. "Guatemala has been experiencing significant civil unrest. Many rural communities have been forced to relocate for their safety, but usually, we would have received some kind of communication from Pastor Mendez or the village leaders. The American Embassy in Guatemala was contacted, but their resources for locating missing persons in remote rural areas were severely limited. They filed a report and promised to alert consular services if any information about Sarah Mackenzie surfaced, but held out little hope for immediate resolution. As autumn approached in 1993, Covenant Community Church was forced to confront the possibility that Sarah Mackenzie might never return to Pine Ridge. The congregation struggled with questions that had no easy answers. Had Sarah been killed in political violence? Had she been kidnapped? Had she chosen to remain in Guatemala permanently? Or had some accident befallen her in the remote mountains where communication was impossible? Pastor Thornton organized special prayer services every Friday evening, where the congregation would gather to intercede specifically for Sarah's safety and for God's will to be revealed. These services became powerful times of corporate worship and mourning as the church family processed their grief and fear together. "We don't know where Sarah is," Pastor Thornton would say during these gatherings, his voice heavy with emotion, "but we know where she isn't. She isn't beyond God's sight. She isn't outside God's protection. And she isn't forgotten by the God who called her to serve him." Martha Collins channeled her anxiety into action, organizing letter-writing campaigns to congressional representatives, and contacting every missionary organization operating in Central America. She created a simple newsletter called Searching for Sarah that was distributed to churches throughout the Southeast, asking for prayers and any information that might lead to Sarah's whereabouts. "I can't just sit here and do nothing," Martha told Mrs. Hartwell as they stuffed envelopes with the latest newsletter. "Sarah would do the same for any of us. She's not just missing, she's our sister, and we don't abandon family." But as 1993 turned into 1994, and 1994 became 1995, hope began to fade even among Sarah's most optimistic supporters. The political situation in Guatemala showed no signs of improving, and several other missionaries had been forced to evacuate their posts due to increasing violence. In September 1995, exactly 4 years after Sarah's departure from Pine Ridge, Covenant Community Church held a memorial service in her honor. Pastor Thornton was careful not to call it a funeral, since Sarah's fate remained unknown. But the congregation needed a way to formally acknowledge their loss and celebrate Sarah's life and ministry. "Today we honor the memory of Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie," Pastor Thornton announced to the overflowing sanctuary, "a young woman who heard God's call and answered without hesitation. We may not know what became of her earthly body, but we know with certainty that her spirit remains with the Lord she served so faithfully." The service featured testimonies from church members whose lives Sarah had touched, readings from her letters from Guatemala, and the singing of her favorite hymns. Mrs. Hartwell read Sarah's final letter to the congregation, dated February 5, 1993, "My beloved church family. As I write this letter by candlelight in my small hut, I am overwhelmed by gratitude for the privilege of serving our Lord in this beautiful, broken place. Today I watched a young boy named Miguel take his first halting steps while reading from the book of John. The words 'God so loved the world' seemed to come alive in his voice, and I realized anew that love truly is the universal language. Whatever trials may come, whatever hardships we may face, we can be confident that God's love never fails, and his purposes never fail. Thank you for your faithful prayers and support. I carry each of you in my heart as I continue this wonderful journey of faith." As the letter was read, many in the congregation wept openly, struck by the prophetic nature of Sarah's words about trials and hardships to come. Her faith had remained strong, even as she faced unknown dangers, a testimony that would encourage and challenge the church for years to come. The memorial service concluded with the congregation singing "It Is Well With My Soul," a hymn that Sarah had requested in one of her early letters from Guatemala. As the voices rose in harmony, many felt a supernatural peace settle over the sanctuary, as if Sarah herself was joining them in worship from wherever she might be. Following the memorial service, a beautiful garden was planted on the church grounds in Sarah's honor. The Sarah Mackenzie Memorial Garden featured her favorite flowers, white roses and purple irises, arranged around a simple stone bench where people could come to pray and remember. A small plaque bore the inscription, in memory of Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie, faithful servant of Christ, who carried his light to distant lands. Her legacy of love continues to shine. But even as the congregation tried to find closure through the memorial service and garden, many privately continued to hope and pray for Sarah's safe return. Martha Collins never stopped writing letters to government officials and missionary organizations. Mrs. Hartwell continued to set aside money each month from the church's missions budget, just in case Sarah might someday need financial assistance. To return home, Pastor Thornton often visited the memorial garden in the early morning hours, when dew still clung to the roses and the Alabama sunrise painted the sky in gentle pastels. He would sit on the stone bench and pray for the young woman he had loved like a daughter, asking God to watch over her wherever she might be and to grant peace to all those who missed her. Lord, he would whisper, his voice carried away by the morning breeze, we entrust Sarah to your care, just as she entrusted her life to your will. If she is with you in glory, we rejoice in her victory. If she is still alive somewhere in this world, we ask for your protection and provision. And we ask for the faith to trust you, even when we cannot understand your ways. As the years passed, Sarah Mackenzie's story became part of the folklore of Pine Ridge. Newcomers to the community would hear about the brave young missionary who had disappeared in Guatemala, and longtime residents would share memories of her vibrant faith and sacrificial love. Children who had been in her Sunday school classes grew up and had children of their own, passing down stories of Miss Sarah who had taught them that God could use anyone willing to say yes to his call. The mystery of Sarah's fate remained unsolved as Pine Ridge entered the new millennium. Technology improved, global communications became more reliable, and international travel became easier. But none of these advances brought any new information about what had happened to Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie. What no one in Pine Ridge could have imagined was that the answers they sought were not thousands of miles away in the mountains of Guatemala, but buried just a few hundred yards from where they gathered each Sunday morning to worship and remember their lost missionary. 28 years after Sarah Mackenzie's disappearance, Pine Ridge had evolved from a sleepy Alabama town into a growing suburban community. Young families attracted by affordable housing and good schools had swelled the population from 3,000 to nearly 15,000 residents. Covenant Community Church had grown along with the town, expanding its original sanctuary twice and adding a modern fellowship hall, children's ministry complex, and administrative offices. Pastor David Thornton had retired in 2010 after serving the congregation for 37 years, spending his final years in ministry treasuring the memories of the young missionary whose fate had never been determined. His successor, Pastor Mikhail Garrett, was an energetic man in his 40s who had heard Sarah's story countless times during his 7 years leading the congregation. The church's growth necessitated yet another expansion project in 2019. The new plan called for a state-of-the-art children's ministry building that would be constructed adjacent to the existing facilities. The project required extensive excavation of an area that had previously been used for overflow parking during Easter and Christmas services. Jake Thompson, owner of Thompson Construction and a member of Covenant Community Church, had been awarded the contract for the expansion. Jake's crew began site preparation on a crisp morning in October 2019, starting with the removal of several old oak trees that had shaded the parking area for decades. Careful with that big oak over there, Jake called out to his excavator operator, Tommy Rodriguez. Mrs. Chen from the Historical Society wants to see if those tree rings can tell us anything about the area's history. Tommy had been operating heavy machinery for Thompson Construction for over a decade, and he took pride in the precision of his work. As he carefully uprooted the massive oak tree, which appeared to be nearly a century old, he noticed something unusual in the soil where the roots had been deepest. "Hey Jake," Tommy shouted over the rumble of the excavator's engine. "You need to come look at this." Jake made his way across the construction site, dodging other workers who were surveying and marking utility lines. When he reached Tommy's excavator, he could see his operator pointing down into the hole where the oak tree's roots had been extracted. "What is it?" Jake asked, shielding his eyes from the bright October sun. "Look right there, about 6 feet down," Tommy replied, pointing to a specific area of the excavation. "That's not natural soil stratification. Somebody dug here a long time ago and backfilled it." Jake climbed down into the excavation site to get a closer look. Tommy was right. The soil layers were clearly disturbed, showing signs of human intervention, rather than natural settling. More intriguingly, there appeared to be fragments of fabric and what looked like leather protruding from the disturbed earth. "Shut down the excavator," Jake instructed. "We need to call Pastor Garrett before we go any further." Pastor Michael Garrett arrived at the construction site within 20 minutes, accompanied by several church board members who had been in a morning meeting when Jake called. The discovery of what appeared to be deliberately buried materials on church property raised immediate questions about historical significance and, potentially, legal implications. "Could this be an old cemetery?" asked board member Susan Williams, a retired history teacher who had lived in Pine Ridge her entire life. I know there were several family burial plots in this area before the church was built. That's possible, Pastor Garrett replied, studying the excavation site carefully. But if it is, we would need to contact the state archaeological office before proceeding. We can't risk disturbing human remains without proper permits and procedures. Jake Thompson was examining the visible fragments more closely. Pastor, I don't think this is an old burial. The materials I can see look more recent than that, maybe 30 or 40 years old, rather than a century. And the way it's buried suggests it was a single event rather than a formal interment. The group decided to halt all construction work until they could determine what lay buried beneath the old oak tree. Pastor Garrett contacted the Pine Ridge Police Department to report the discovery, unsure whether they were dealing with a historical artifact, an environmental issue, or something more serious. Detective Lisa Carter, a 15-year veteran of the Pine Ridge Police Department, arrived at the church within an hour. Carter had joined the force as a young officer just 5 years after Sarah Mackenzie's disappearance, and she was familiar with the cold case that had never been officially closed. Pastor Garrett, Detective Carter said as she surveyed the excavation site, I want to proceed very carefully here. Given the location and the apparent age of the burial, this could potentially be related to the Mackenzie case. I'm going to call for a forensic archaeologist to supervise any further excavation. The mention of Sarah Mackenzie's name sent a ripple of excitement and apprehension through the gathered church members. Many of them had heard stories about the young missionary, and several older members had actually known her personally. You really think this could be connected to Sarah? Asked Tom Bradley, whose wife had been one of Sarah's closest friends at the church. After all these years? I don't want to speculate, Detective Carter replied professionally, but we owe it to her memory and to this congregation to investigate this discovery thoroughly and properly. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic archaeologist from Auburn University, arrived the next morning with a team of graduate students and specialized excavation equipment. Dr. Foster had worked on numerous cases involving the recovery of human remains, from historical burials to modern crime scenes. The first step, Dr. Forster explained to the assembled group of church members and construction workers, is to carefully map and photograph the site exactly as we found it. Then we'll begin systematic excavation using archaeological techniques, rather than construction equipment. The excavation process was painstakingly slow. With every shovelful of earth carefully sifted and examined, Dr. Foster's team worked in grid squares, documenting the location and depth of every artifact before removing it from the ground. On the second day of the archaeological excavation, one of Dr. Foster's graduate students made the discovery that would change everything. Dr. Foster called out Jennifer Martinez, a third-year graduate student who was working in the deepest section of the excavation. I've found something significant. Dr. Foster immediately stopped her own work and moved to Jennifer's grid square. There, partially buried in the red Alabama clay at a depth of nearly 7 feet, was a tarnished silver chain with a cross pendant attached. That's definitely not a natural deposit, Dr. Foster observed, carefully brushing soil away from the artifact. This was placed here deliberately, and relatively recently in archaeological terms. As Dr. Foster continued to expose the cross and chain, more artifacts became visible in the surrounding soil. Fragments of cloth, pieces of leather that appeared to be from a book or journal, and what looked like personal effects were scattered in a small area, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet. We're looking at a deliberate burial, Dr. Foster announced. To the watching group, someone placed these items here intentionally, probably within the last 30 to 40 years, based on the soil conditions and the state of preservation. Pastor Garrett felt his heart racing as he watched the careful excavation. The timeline matched perfectly with Sarah Mackenzie's disappearance, and the cross pendant looked remarkably similar to the one described in Sarah's letters and remembered by church members who had known her. Could I look at that cross more closely? Asked Martha Collins, now in her late 50s, but still sharp and observant. Martha had been Sarah's best friend and had preserved every letter, photograph, and memento from their friendship. Dr. Foster carefully lifted the cross and chain from the soil and placed it in a clear evidence bag. Even through the plastic, the distinctive features of the cross were clearly visible. It was an ornate, silver piece with small engravings around the edges and what appeared to be an inscription on the back. Martha gasped as she examined the cross. That's Sarah's cross. I'm absolutely certain of it. Her grandmother gave it to her when she was confirmed, and she wore it every single day. See that small dent on the left arm of the cross? She got that when we were teenagers and she fell off her bike. I was with her when it happened. The confirmation that the cross belonged to Sarah Mackenzie transformed the excavation from an archaeological curiosity into a potential crime scene. Detective Carter immediately contacted the state police and the FBI, since Sarah's disappearance had occurred in a foreign country and involved potential international implications. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Foster's team carefully recovered dozens of artifacts from the burial site. In addition to the cross, they found fragments of Sarah's personal Bible, pages from what appeared to be a journal or diary, pieces of clothing that matched descriptions of what Sarah had been wearing when she left for Guatemala, and, most significantly, a small leather-bound notebook that had been remarkably well preserved due to the specific soil conditions. The notebook appeared to be a personal diary that Sarah had kept during her final months in Guatemala. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but much of the text remained legible. The entries painted a picture of a young woman facing increasing danger and growing uncertainty about the people she had trusted. January 15, 1993, read the first recovered entry. Pastor Carlos has been acting strangely lately. I caught him meeting with men I don't recognize, and when I asked about them, he became defensive and told me to focus on my own ministry. Something doesn't feel right, but I'm praying for wisdom and discernment. Subsequent entries revealed Sarah's growing concerns about corruption and violence in the village where she had been serving. She wrote about money that was supposed to go to community development projects but seemed to disappear instead. She described seeing weapons being moved through the village at night, and her attempts to understand what was happening around her. February 10, 1993. Read another entry. I've discovered something terrible. Pastor Carlos and several village leaders are involved in smuggling operations drugs. I think, though they try to hide it from me, they're using the church's reputation and my presence as an American missionary to provide cover for their activities. I confronted Carlos yesterday, and he told me to forget what I think I've seen if I want to stay safe. I'm scared, but I can't be part of this deception. The final entry in the recovered diary was dated February 28, 1993, just 2 weeks before Sarah's last letter reached Pine Ridge. I've made my decision. I'm going to report what I've discovered to the mission organization and to the American embassy. Carlos threatened me again today, saying that Americans who cause trouble in Guatemala sometimes get lost in the mountains and never come home. I'm not naive, I know the danger I'm in. If something happens to me, I want people to know the truth. I came here to serve God, not to be part of criminal activities. I've hidden this diary and my personal effects in a place where they'll be safe. If I don't survive this, I pray that someday the truth will come to light and justice will be done. The discovery of Sarah's diary and personal effects raised more questions than it answered. How had her belongings ended up buried in Pine Ridge when she had disappeared in Guatemala? Who had brought them back to Alabama? And why had they been hidden on church property? Detective Carter coordinated with federal authorities to review the original investigation into Sarah's disappearance. The FBI had maintained a file on the case, but it had been classified as inactive due to lack of leads and the challenges of investigating crimes that occurred in foreign countries during periods of civil unrest. We're reopening this case with a full investigation, Special Agent Robert Kim announced during a press conference at the Pine Ridge Police Department. The recovery of Miss Mackenzie's personal effects suggests that her disappearance may have been the result of criminal activity, and we believe there may be individuals with knowledge of what happened to her who are living in the United States. The news that Sarah Mackenzie's belongings had been found buried on church property sent shockwaves through the Pine Ridge community and the broader network of churches that had supported her mission work. After nearly 30 years of uncertainty, there was finally tangible evidence of what had happened to the beloved young missionary. But the discovery also brought new anguish for those who had loved Sarah. The revelation that she had been in danger and had tried to report criminal activity before her disappearance painted her death in an even more tragic light. She had not simply been the victim of political violence or an unfortunate accident. She had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. Pastor Garrett organized prayer services and counseling sessions for church members who were struggling to process the new information about Sarah's fate. The congregation that had prayed for her safe return for nearly 3 decades now had to come to terms with the confirmation of her death and the disturbing circumstances surrounding it. Sarah died because she refused to compromise her integrity. Pastor Garrett preached the Sunday after the diary entries were made public. She could have stayed silent about the corruption she witnessed. She could have looked the other way and protected herself, but she chose to stand for truth and justice, even knowing the cost might be her life. As the investigation continued, federal authorities began the complex process of connecting events that had occurred in Guatemala in 1993 with evidence found in Alabama in 2019. The challenge was enormous. Many of the potential witnesses and suspects from Guatemala were dead, missing, or living under assumed identities. But the discovery of Sarah's buried belongings had provided investigators with something they had lacked for nearly 30 years. Concrete evidence that crimes had been committed and that someone with detailed knowledge of Sarah's fate had been in Pine Ridge at some point after her disappearance. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was simple but profound. Who had brought Sarah Mackenzie's belongings back to Alabama, and why had they chosen to bury them on the grounds of the church that had sent her to Guatemala? The answer, when it finally came, would reveal a conspiracy that reached much closer to home than anyone had ever imagined. As federal investigators delved deeper into Sarah Mackenzie's case, they began focusing on individuals who had been connected to her mission work and who would have had both the means and opportunity to transport her belongings from Guatemala to Pine Ridge. The list of suspects was surprisingly short, consisting primarily of mission organization, personnel, and church leaders who had traveled to Guatemala during the 1990s. Special Agent Robert Kim and his team conducted extensive background checks on everyone associated with Sarah's mission placement. They discovered that the mission organization that had facilitated Sarah's work in Guatemala, Global Harvest Ministries, had ceased operations in 1997 amid financial irregularities and questions about their oversight of field missionaries. Global Harvest Ministries was essentially a front operation, Agent Kim explained to Detective Carter during one of their coordination meetings. The organization claimed to be placing missionaries in remote villages throughout Central America, but were finding evidence that they were actually facilitating drug trafficking operations using missionary activities as cover. The investigation revealed that Robert Martinez, the mission coordinator, who had spoken with Pastor Thornton about Sarah's disappearance in 1993, had fled the United States in 1996, just ahead of a federal investigation into Global Harvest Ministries. Martinez had been living in Costa Rica under an assumed name until his death from cancer in 2015. However, the breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic archaeologist who had supervised the excavation of Sarah's belongings, discovered additional evidence that had been overlooked during the initial recovery process. I was analyzing soil samples from different depths of the burial site, Dr. Foster explained to the investigative team. When I found traces of concrete and gravel that didn't match the natural soil composition, it appears that something heavy was placed on top of the burial site after Sarah's belongings were interred. Further, investigation revealed that a concrete memorial marker had once stood directly above the location where Sarah's belongings were buried. Church records showed that the marker had been installed in September 1993, exactly 2 years after Sarah's departure for Guatemala, and had been removed in 2010 during a landscaping project. The memorial marker had been donated by a longtime member of Covenant Community Church, Charles Whitman, who had served as the church's missions committee chairman during the 1990s. Whitman had been instrumental in raising funds for Sarah's mission work and had maintained correspondence with Global Harvest Ministries throughout her placement. Detective Carter interviewed Whitman, now 78 years old and living in a Pine Ridge nursing home. Initially, Whitman appeared confused by questions about the memorial marker and claimed not to remember many details from the 1990s. "I'm an old man," Whitman told Detective Carter during their first interview. "My memory isn't what it used to be. I donated money for lots of church projects over the years, but when Agent Kim joined the interrogation and presented Whitman with financial records showing suspicious money transfers between his personal accounts and Global Harvest Ministries, the elderly man's demeanor changed dramatically. "You don't understand," Whitman said, his voice trembling. "I was trying to help. I thought I was helping Sarah and the other missionaries." Under persistent questioning, Whitman began to reveal the truth about his involvement with Global Harvest Ministries and the circumstances surrounding Sarah Mackenzie's death. "Robert Martinez contacted me in 1992, Whitman confessed. He said Global Harvest needed additional funding for security measures in Guatemala because of the Civil War. He convinced me that our missionaries were in danger and needed protection." Whitman had initially provided legitimate donations to support missionary security, but gradually became involved in what Martinez described as special operations that required absolute secrecy. "Martinez told me that some of our missionaries had been forced to work with local authorities to gather intelligence about rebel activities," Whitman continued. He said it was dangerous work but necessary to protect American lives. The reality, as investigators would later determine, was that Global Harvest Ministries was using American missionaries as unwitting couriers and sources of intelligence for drug trafficking operations. The missionaries believed they were supporting legitimate community development projects, while their activities were actually facilitating criminal enterprises. Sarah Mackenzie had discovered the truth about these operations and had threatened to expose them when she contacted the mission organization to report her concerns. Her message was intercepted by Martinez and his associates rather than reaching legitimate authorities. "Martinez called me in March 1993, Whitman revealed, tears streaming down his weathered face. He said Sarah had gotten involved with rebel sympathizers and was going to be arrested by Guatemalan authorities. He said the only way to save her was to get her out of the country immediately, but it had to be done quietly to avoid creating an international incident." Whitman's account revealed the horrific truth. Sarah Mackenzie had not been killed by the corrupt village leaders she had tried to expose. Instead, she had been murdered by the very mission organization that was supposed to protect her. "Martinez told me that Sarah had been safely evacuated from Guatemala and was being relocated to a secure location," Whitman continued through his tears. He said she couldn't contact anyone from Pine Ridge because her safety depended on complete secrecy. "He gave me some of her personal belongings and said I should keep them safe until she could return." Whitman had believed Martinez's lies for months, continuing to send money to support what he thought was Sarah's protection and eventual repatriation. It wasn't until Global Harvest Ministries collapsed in 1997 that he began to suspect he had been deceived. "By then it was too late," Whitman said. "Martinez had disappeared, and I realized that Sarah was probably dead. I had been sending money to criminals and my actions had contributed to whatever happened to her. The weight of his guilt and complicity had tormented Whitman for over 20 years. He had buried Sarah's belongings on church property because he couldn't bear to destroy them, but he also couldn't risk their discovery leading to his exposure. I placed the memorial marker over the burial site, Whitman admitted. I thought if anyone ever found her things, I could claim I was just trying to honor her memory. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Agent Kim and Detective Carter verified Whitman's account through financial records and by cross-referencing his story with information obtained from Guatemalan authorities. The investigation confirmed that Sarah Mackenzie had been murdered in Guatemala in March 1993, shortly after she attempted to report criminal activities to what she believed were legitimate authorities. Miss Mackenzie was killed because she threatened to expose a drug trafficking operation that was using missionary activities as cover, Agent Kim announced during a press conference. Her death was not the result of political violence or random crime, but a calculated murder designed to protect criminal conspirators. The revelation that Charles Whitman, a respected church leader, had been unknowingly complicit in the criminal conspiracy that led to Sarah's death devastated the Covenant Community Church congregation. Many members had known Whitman personally and had considered him a pillar of the church community. Pastor Garrett struggled with how to help his congregation process the betrayal they felt, not only toward Whitman but toward the mission organization they had trusted with Sarah's life. We are reminded, Pastor Garrett preached the Sunday after Whitman's confession became public, that evil sometimes disguises itself as good, and that even well-meaning people can be deceived by those with malicious intentions. But we are also reminded that truth ultimately prevails, and that God sees and knows all things. The investigation into Sarah's murder revealed the existence of a broader criminal network that had operated throughout Central America during the 1990s, using religious organizations as fronts for drug trafficking operations. Several former Global Harvest Ministries personnel were arrested and charged with various crimes, though many of the key figures, including Robert Martinez, had died before they could be brought to justice. Charles Whitman was charged with money laundering and conspiracy related to his financial support of Global Harvest Ministries. But his advanced age and cooperation with investigators resulted in a plea agreement that allowed him to serve his sentence under house arrest. I know I can never undo the damage I've caused, Whitman said during his sentencing hearing. I was a foolish old man who thought he was helping protect missionaries, but instead I helped the people who killed Sarah Mackenzie. I pray that God and Sarah's memory can somehow forgive me. The resolution of Sarah's case brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief to the Pine Ridge community. After nearly 30 years of hoping for her safe return, they finally knew with certainty that Sarah had died in Guatemala while trying to do the right thing. But the investigation also revealed the extraordinary courage Sarah had shown in her final weeks. Despite knowing she was in danger, she had refused to compromise her principles or remain silent about the corruption she had witnessed. The winter of 2020 brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Ridge. Elena Mendez, a 52-year-old woman from Guatemala City, arrived at Covenant Community Church on a snowy December morning, clutching a worn manila envelope and speaking broken English mixed with tears. Please, she said to Pastor Garrett as he greeted visitors after the Sunday morning service. I must speak with you about Sarah Mackenzie. I have traveled very far to bring you something that belongs to her. Pastor Garrett immediately brought Elena to his office, where she carefully opened the envelope and revealed additional pages from Sarah's diary that had been preserved by Elena's late father, Pastor Carlos Mendez, the same village pastor mentioned in Sarah's recovered journal entries. My father, he was not good man in 1993, Elena began, her voice heavy with emotion and the weight of old shame. He was involved with the bad men, the drug people, but Sarah, she changed his heart before she died. Elena's story revealed the final pieces of Sarah Mackenzie's tragic tale. Her father, Carlos Mendez, had indeed been involved with a drug trafficking operation that used the village church as a cover, but Sarah's unwavering faith in gentle confrontations about the criminal activities had gradually convicted Carlos of his sins. Sarah, she never stopped believing my father could change, Elena continued, tears flowing freely. Even when she discovered the truth about the drugs, she prayed for him every day. She told him that God's grace was bigger than any sin, that it was not too late to choose right over wrong. Carlos Mendez had been present when Global Harvest Ministries personnel arrived in the village to silence Sarah permanently. The official story was that Sarah had fled to avoid arrest for rebel sympathies. But Carlos knew the truth. She had been murdered for threatening to expose the trafficking operation. My father, he tried to stop them, Elena sobbed. He said Sarah was innocent, that she was just trying to serve God, but they told him if he interfered, our whole family would be killed. So he watched them take her away, and he never forgave himself. After Sarah's murder, Carlos Mendez had secretly retrieved some of her remaining personal belongings before Global Harvest personnel could destroy all evidence of her presence in the village. He had hidden Sarah's additional diary pages, some photographs, and letters she had written but never sent. For 27 years, my father carried this guilt, Elena explained. Every Sunday when he preached, He remembered Sarah's words about courage and truth. Slowly, God changed his heart. Completely, he spent his last years helping other missionaries and trying to make up for what he had done. Before his death in 2019, Carlos Mendez had made Alina promise to travel to Pine Ridge and deliver Sarah's remaining belongings to her home church. He had saved money for years to pay for Elena's trip, seeing it as his final act of repentance. He told me to tell you that Sarah died like Jesus, innocent, but willing to die for truth and righteousness, Alina said. He said her death changed him from a criminal to a true servant of God. Among the items Alina brought were several unsent letters Sarah had written to her Pine Ridge church family during her final weeks in Guatemala. These letters revealed Sarah's spiritual struggle as she grappled with the discovery of corruption, and her decision to speak out despite the danger. One letter, dated March 1, 1993, read, "Dear Pastor Thornton and my beloved church family, I am facing the greatest test of my faith since I arrived in Guatemala. I have discovered that people I trusted have been using our mission work as cover for terrible crimes. I know that speaking out will put me in danger, but I cannot remain silent while God's work is being perverted for evil purposes. Please pray for me to have wisdom and courage. If something happens to me, please know that I go to meet Jesus with no regrets about following his call to serve the least of these." Another letter, apparently written just days before her death, contained words that would bring both comfort and renewed grief to those who had loved her. "I have been thinking about the hymn we used to sing together. It is well with my soul. Whatever storms may come, whatever trials I may face, I can truly say that it is well with my soul because my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus Christ. If this letter is my last communication with you, please remember that serving God among these precious people has been the greatest privilege of my life. The love you showed me prepared me to love others sacrificially. Thank you for being the family God used to shape my heart for his service." Alina also brought photographs that Sarah had taken of the children she taught and the families she served in Guatemala. These pictures showed Sarah surrounded by smiling faces, teaching children to read using picture books of Bible stories, helping women learn to sew and sell their crafts, and participating in simple village celebrations. "She loved our people so much," Alina said as she showed Pastor Garrett and the gathered church leaders through the photographs. Even when she discovered the corruption, she never stopped loving the innocent villagers who had nothing to do with the crimes. "She saw the good in everyone, even in my father when he was still doing evil things." The revelation that Sarah's faith and witness had ultimately led to Carlos Mendez's conversion provided a measure of redemption to her tragic story. Despite being murdered for her convictions, Sarah's life had accomplished exactly what she had prayed for, bringing people to salvation through Christ. Pastor Garrett organized a special memorial service to honor Elena's visit and to celebrate the new understanding of Sarah's final days. The service drew hundreds of people, including former church members who had moved away from Pine Ridge, but returned to pay their respects to the missionary whose story had shaped their understanding of sacrificial service. Sarah's legacy is not primarily that she died for her faith, Pastor Garrett preached during the memorial service. Her legacy is that she lived for her faith so completely that even her death became an instrument of God's grace in the life of a man who desperately needed redemption. Alina Mendez remained in Pine Ridge for 2 weeks, staying in the home of Martha Collins, who had never married and had devoted much of her life to preserving Sarah's memory. The two women, despite their language barriers, formed a deep bond over their shared love for Sarah and their mutual grief over her loss. "Alina helped me understand that Sarah's death was not meaningless," Martha reflected. "Knowing that Carlos Mendez came to faith because of Sarah's witness, and that Alina herself is now a Christian because of her father's transformation, it shows how God can bring beauty from ashes." During Elena's visit, she also shared information that helped federal investigators close several remaining questions about the Global Harvest Ministries trafficking operation. Her testimony provided crucial evidence that led to additional arrests of former organization personnel who had evaded justice for nearly 3 decades. The complete resolution of Sarah's case allowed Covenant Community Church to finally plan a proper memorial for their beloved missionary. The congregation voted unanimously to expand the Sarah Mackenzie Memorial Garden and to establish a scholarship fund for young people pursuing missionary service. The new memorial featured a bronze statue of Sarah reading 2 children, surrounded by flowering plants native to both Alabama and Guatemala. The base of the statue bore an inscription taken from one of her final letters. "The love you showed me prepared me to love others sacrificially." But perhaps the most meaningful memorial was the establishment of the Sarah Mackenzie Center for Missionary Care, a ministry that provides counseling, safety training, and ongoing support for missionaries serving in dangerous or difficult locations. The center was funded through donations from churches throughout the Southeast that had been inspired by Sarah's story. "We cannot bring Sarah back," Pastor Garrett explained during the center's dedication ceremony, "but we can honor her memory by better protecting and supporting the missionaries who follow in her footsteps." Alina Mendez returned to Guatemala with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to continue the work Sarah had begun in her father's village. She established a small school where children could learn to read using the same methods Sarah had employed, and she organized women's cooperatives that allowed villagers to support themselves through legitimate means rather than involvement with criminal enterprises. Sarah planted seeds that are still growing. Alina wrote in a letter to Covenant Community Church 6 months after her visit. Every child who learns to read, every family that finds honest work, every person who hears about Jesus, these are fruits of the love Sarah shared with us. The story of Sarah Mackenzie's life, death, and posthumous impact spread far beyond Pine Ridge. Christian magazines published articles about her sacrifice and the unexpected ways God had used her witness to bring about redemption and justice. Missions organizations began implementing new safety protocols and accountability measures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had led to Sarah's death. Charles Whitman, serving his sentence under house arrest, spent his remaining years writing letters of apology to everyone affected by his unwitting participation in the criminal conspiracy. He donated his entire estate to missions organizations with strong oversight and transparency records, attempting to make some amends for the harm his naivety had caused. I was a foolish old man who thought good intentions could substitute for wisdom and discernment, Whitman wrote in a letter published in the Pine Ridge newspaper. Sarah Mackenzie died because people like me made it easy for criminals to infiltrate and corrupt legitimate ministries. I pray that others will learn from my mistakes and demand true accountability from the organizations they support. Tom Bradley, whose wife had been one of Sarah's closest friends, became an advocate for missionary safety and established an organization that provides independent oversight of mission agencies operating in high-risk areas. His work was directly inspired by the realization that better accountability might have prevented Sarah's death. Sarah trusted the people who were supposed to protect her, and that trust was betrayed in the most horrible way possible, Bradley said during a conference on missionary safety. We owe it to her memory and to current missionaries to ensure that such betrayals never happen again. As Pine Ridge entered 2021, 30 years after Sarah Mackenzie's departure for Guatemala, her influence continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Young people who had grown up hearing her story chose careers in ministry, humanitarian work, and social justice. Churches throughout Alabama adopted new policies for vetting and supporting missionary personnel. Families who had been touched by her story made commitments to support orphanages and schools in Guatemala and other Central American countries. Martha Collins, now approaching retirement, donated her extensive collection of Sarah's letters, photographs, and memorabilia to the Southern Baptist Seminary archives, ensuring that future generations of missionary candidates would have access to Sarah's example of faithful service in difficult circumstances. Sarah always said that she wanted her life to count for something eternal. Martha reflected during the donation ceremony, I think she would be amazed to see how many lives have been changed by her example. How many people have found courage to serve God because they were inspired by her story. Pastor David G. Thornton, though retired, remained active in promoting Sarah's legacy and advocating for missionary safety. At 91 years old, he continued to correspond with Alina Mendez and other Christians in Guatemala who had been touched by Sarah's brief but impactful ministry. Sarah was like a daughter to me, Pastor Thornton said during his final public appearance at the 10th anniversary memorial service in 2021. I sent her to Guatemala believing God would protect her, and I struggled for years with anger and confusion when she was killed. But now I see that God did protect her. He protected her spirit, her witness, and her legacy. Death could not silence the love she shared or diminish the faith she demonstrated. The investigation into Sarah's death had also led to broader reforms in how religious organizations conduct international ministry. New laws required greater financial transparency and background checks for mission agency personnel, while international agreements improved communication between countries when missionaries faced danger. Detective Lisa Carter, who had coordinated the investigation into Sarah's case, often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. The resolution of Sarah's murder after nearly 30 years had demonstrated how modern forensic techniques and persistent investigation could bring justice, even in seemingly hopeless situations. The Mackenzie case taught us that truth has a way of surfacing, even when people try to bury it. Detective Carter explained to a conference of international law enforcement officials. It also showed us that ordinary people, construction workers, church members, retired professors can all play crucial roles in solving complex cases. As Pine Ridge prepared to mark the 30th anniversary of Sarah Mackenzie's disappearance in September 2021, the community reflected on how profoundly her story had shaped their understanding of faith, justice, and divine providence. What had begun as a tragic mystery had become a powerful testimony to the ways God can bring redemption from even the most heartbreaking circumstances. The annual Sarah Mackenzie Memorial Service had grown into a regional event that drew missionaries, church leaders, and ordinary believers from across the Southeast. The 2021 service featured Alina Mendez as the keynote speaker, sharing how Sarah's influence had continued to impact lives in Guatemala 3 decades after her death. Sarah came to Guatemala to share God's love with us. Alina said as she stood before the overflowing sanctuary of Covenant Community Church. She succeeded beyond what anyone could have imagined. Not only did she love us while she lived among us, but her death became the seed of transformation that changed my father's heart and continues to change hearts today. Elena's words echoed the theme that had emerged throughout the long journey toward justice in Sarah's case, that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human evil, and that sacrificial love has the power to transcend even death itself. As the memorial service concluded with the traditional singing of "It Is Well With My Soul," many in the congregation reflected on how Sarah's favorite hymn had become prophetic. Despite the storms and trials she had faced, despite the betrayal and violence that had ended her earthly life, it was indeed well with Sarah's soul, and her witness continued to make it well with the souls of countless others who had been touched by her story. The final discovery related to Sarah's case came in November 2021, when renovation work at the old Global Harvest Ministries headquarters in Atlanta uncovered additional documents that had been hidden in a wall cavity similar to where Sarah's belongings had been found in Pine Ridge. These documents provided evidence that led to the arrest and conviction of 3 additional conspirators who had evaded justice for nearly 30 years. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," Special Agent Kim said as the final arrests were made. Sarah Mackenzie's case has shown us that truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deeply people try to bury it. Her courage in standing for righteousness ultimately brought about the exposure and punishment of those who killed her. The resolution of Sarah's case also provided an unexpected gift to the Pine Ridge community: the recovery of additional letters and documents that revealed the depth of Sarah's spiritual maturity and her profound love for the people she served. These writings became the basis for a book about her life and ministry that was published by a Christian publishing house and became a bestseller and missionary in Christian circles. Sarah Mackenzie, Love That Transcends, became required reading in many seminary missions programs and was translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and several indigenous languages for distribution in Central and South America. The book's proceeds were donated to support education and community development programs in Guatemala, continuing Sarah's work of bringing hope and opportunity to struggling communities. As Christmas 2021 approached, marking 30 years since Sarah's final Christmas on Earth, Alina Mendez sent a letter to Covenant Community Church that perfectly captured the redemptive conclusion of Sarah's story. Dear friends in Pine Ridge, as we celebrate the birth of our Savior, I am reminded that Sarah's story is like the story of Christmas itself: light shining in darkness, love conquering hate, and life emerging from death. Sarah came to us as a gift of God's love, and though evil men tried to destroy that gift, they could not silence its message. Every Christmas morning when our children open their eyes and see the hope of a new day, they are seeing with eyes that Sarah helped to open. Every time we gather to worship the Christ child, we remember that Sarah's love for Jesus led her to love us. This is the miracle of Christmas and the miracle of Sarah's life, that God's love cannot be destroyed, only multiplied. The letter was read aloud during the Christmas Eve service at Covenant Community Church, bringing tears to the eyes of congregation members who had prayed for Sarah for 30 years and had finally seen God's faithfulness revealed in the most unexpected ways. As 2022 began, Pine Ridge had been forever changed by the discovery of a buried cross and the revelation of truth that had been hidden for 3 decades. Sarah Mackenzie's story had become woven into the fabric of the community's identity, a reminder that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they choose to follow God's call, regardless of the cost. The cross that had been buried beneath an oak tree had finally fulfilled its purpose, not just as a symbol of Sarah's faith, but as an instrument of God's justice and a beacon of hope for all who believe that love is stronger than death and truth more powerful than deception. In the end, Sarah Mackenzie had achieved exactly what she had prayed for in her final letter to Pine Ridge. Her life had counted for something eternal, and her sacrifice had become a seed of redemption that would continue to bear fruit for generations to come.